Hello everyone, and again, thank you, Rick, for your incredibly kind introduction. I often feel like all of these accolades that I've received are something somehow about somebody else and not me. So it's kind of amazing to come back to the source in a way of my origins as an architect at the school, and it's quite daunting to speak to some of the people who taught me. It doesn't feel like it's been that long. It's funny how time expands and compresses, but you come back and think, actually it wasn't that long ago that I left here, even though it was 25 years this year, which is kind of incredible. So yes, it's an honor for me to come and speak to all of you, and I also really applaud the efforts of the school and of Rick and his team in setting up and curating the Building Waterloo Region Festival, which I think is a fantastic initiative and a very needed element of every city that needs to grow, has to grow, and wants to kind of understand the great, the sort of assets and the wonderful kind of origins and ideas that lie at the founding of every town. Every city has its origins on which we build. So yes, I think the ambition and scope of the festival is fantastic, and I think also part of my talk is talking about some other small-ish Ontario towns where I came from. And so in a way, the title of my talk, Future Heritage and the Cultures of City Building, is about the culture of city building, no matter what place it is and no matter what scale. There is a culture that can be enriched and interpreted and serve as a medium for us as creative people, as authors of the built environment, to really build a future that is meaningful and provides value in all its aspects: economic value, social value, cultural value in all its senses. So I'm going to sort of immerse you immediately in a recent experience I had in London, which was going to see a concert in Somerset House, which is off the Strand. I saw Little Dragon, the sort of ambient house band, play with some friends, some other graduates of Waterloo, Dominique Gagnon, if anybody remembers him, and some other friends. And it just kind of struck me that this kind of is a distillation of what the heritage, the architectural and urban heritage of London delivers 200 years after it was built. This quadrangle, which is Somerset House, is a product of William Chambers, 1775. It was built as a government offices, but a kind of highly mixed use government offices, and now serves as a very, much like many of London's buildings, a kind of very solid and kind of modest, in a way, building that holds the street, forms part of a streetscape, but sort of beyond its arches, there's this kind of amazing world that's revealed when you pass through the facade. And it acts now as a venue for concerts. It's also the Courtauld Institute. It's part of King's College London. So it's transformed in its use from a kind of mixed-use quadrangle that was government offices, the Royal Academy of Arts, Royal Society, the Society of Antiquaries and Navy Board, and the Barge Master's Office. And this was a really radical idea in 1780, the idea that many government departments and arts organizations would coexist in a quadrangle. But in a way, this typology of the quad is something that both characterizes London, many of London's buildings, its garden squares, and other cities such as Oxford and Cambridge, where the quadrangle as a typology is kind of the DNA of the urban form. And what's kind of amazing about this building is that the concept here, William Chambers' concept was that it should be a series of townhouses arranged as a quadrangle. So the idea that each department and the various people who lived and worked in this complex was conceived as a kind of collection of houses, of townhouses. So this kind of confluence of civic building, urban form, and the idea of a house is I find kind of fascinating as a kind of model of a mixed-use urban building from 1780 that today finds life, contributes to the cultural life of London in such a proactive way. So this kind of transformation, this kind of adaptability of the type of this heritage building contributes to the social culture of London as much as the architectural culture, and is a kind of wonderful example, I think, of heritage that becomes part of a sort of future urban life. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about my origins. I often get asked at the end of lectures where I came from and how did I get where I am, and so I thought I would get it over with at the beginning of the lecture. And maybe it would give a bit of insight into also my approach to city building and ideas of identity, urban identity, architectural identity. And I think also one of the reasons I was sort of brave enough to put this on the screen is that I read Louis Sullivan's book, The Autobiography of an Idea, a couple of years ago, and it kind of amazed me, the kind of honesty and the kind of mystical quality of Louis Sullivan's approach to nature and the kind of conjunction of major infrastructure projects with the American landscape in the mid-19th century. And it sort of occurred to me that I had that as well when I was a kid, in the form of the bridge over the Welland Canal. I lived in Welland till I was about 13, and I had to cross this bridge sort of every weekend when I was walking to brownies or other sort of things, because the town centre was on the other side of the bridge. And it's a pretty amazing structure, also interestingly constructed by mainly Mohawk First Nation steelworkers. And is part of the sort of infrastructure, landscape infrastructure of the Niagara Peninsula, because obviously Niagara Falls and the Niagara River is here, and Welland, I think, is about there. And the Welland Canal bypasses Niagara Falls. So there was this, and the escarpment, the Niagara escarpment is in there somewhere. This kind of omnipresence of the Niagara Falls, the infrastructure of the canal to bypass it, and then these kind of amazing pieces of late Victorian engineering were very much a part of my everyday experience. And the other compelling thing, I was always totally fascinated by the bridge master's house, which was perched on top of the lift bridge. And although I was kind of terrified of crossing the bridge and the fact that it might go up when I was in the middle of the bridge and I would be stuck up there, I was also fascinated by the fact that there could be a house that could move up and down, and that buildings didn't really need to be attached to the ground. But then, of course, this was sort of my nightmare, that I would be stuck up there at the top of the bridge with the bridge master, and then one of the cables would snap on the big concrete counterweights and we come crashing down. So you can say I was sort of traumatized and sort of fascinated at the same time by this piece of infrastructure. And this slide is sort of interesting because I always felt it was a sort of lost place, Welland, that it had this ambition, this kind of an amazing main street image, to have it's sort of a mini Eiffel Tower at the end of your main street was a kind of fantastic thing. And the courthouse, which is still there, the clubhouse, which has been since torn down, of course, because it's one of the few buildings of sort of architectural significance on the banks of the canal, demonstrate a kind of civic aspiration at the founding of this city, and the hope that Welland might someday be a kind of amazing, could have been another Manchester, who knows. But one of the problems of Welland was that it didn't really ever have a sort of good urban plan. It was a very confusing place to live. The Welland River crossed the canal, and there was also train lines and everything just kind of converging in a very disconcerting way. So the kind of legibility and quality of the city as a series of civic spaces was non-existent. This was about as close as you would get to a civic space. So I think, well, Welland kind of died when the industry shut down, Atlas Steel, Union Carbide, and then it really kicked the bucket when the Seaway Mall was built. The sort of downtown core died overnight when this was built in, I think, 1974. And to me, the words of Gertrude Stein kind of epitomize all of these places that are kind of faceless and identityless and ubiquitous in the North American landscape. The mall, the box building with its parking lots. But not everything was bad in the Niagara Peninsula. I sort of grew up with these books in around the house. And my mother actually took a very serious kind of amateur interest in the early architecture of the Niagara region. And this book, which I have a copy of, number 495 out of 500, obviously by Peter Stokes, who taught at the school. And I actually took his measured drawing course, and I think I got a C, which I was really disappointed with. But I just want to show how this kind of tradition, or the art of measured drawings, and really understanding how something like a door comes together out of the various pieces of wood and the joints, and just the kind of joy of drawing and of really understanding how things are made. Traditionally in architecture by craftsmen was quite an influence on me, and this is a reissuing of the book, which I understand happened a couple of years ago. And this kind of led to, I think, my mother's interest in places like Niagara, or was part of her research in a way into places like Niagara on the Lake. And what was really wonderful about Niagara on the Lake, and still is the tradition of sort of Georgian architecture translated to an Ontario style, a very distinctive Ontario vernacular, and which in this case is sort of typified by the fanlight. Apparently nowhere else in the kind of world of neoclassical or even Adam architecture are elliptical fanlights found. It's only in Ontario. And obviously the very kind of legible, rationalist urban planning, which meets the river in a very direct way, and basically is a format for a sort of urban infrastructure that has endured and has become a kind of showcase of the Niagara region's vernacular. Some would say it's overly touristic now. I haven't been there in probably 30 years, but I still think that there's an understanding there that the quality of architecture and the way it operates in its urban landscape is something that's generated huge social and economic and cultural value, not just for Niagara on the Lake, but for the region. And what's interesting for me now in retrospect is to sort of compare the Georgian architecture of early Ontario house building with what was happening in Britain at the same time. So Bath and its crescents was a simultaneous urban and architecture of domestic life, domestic architecture, and a development model at the same time that early Ontario towns were emerging. Sorry, I'm sort of losing control of my slides. And this kind of was part of the next move, which was to Guelph. And here I just show some of the really important books, again, things that I remember from when I was young. And this was kind of one of the first sort of photographic documentaries of Ontario's townscapes. This is a really amazing book. All of the historical atlases of all the different counties in Ontario have not only the sort of urban plan of each town, but also the social history of all of the settlers in the region. They're an amazing resource, and they're beautiful etchings and perspectives of the early settlements, which consists mostly of buildings like this. And this book, The Ancestral Roof, I kind of see now as something that's been kind of in my subconscious or subliminally as an architect, sort of how the roof form can find new expression in contemporary architecture after the suppression of the modern movement. And finally, the architectural folk art and the architecture of barns, which I've also found inspiring in my work and a very important reference both for the character and structural nature of the roofs and just how they sit in the landscape as sort of quite monumental forms, but at the same time of their place and incredibly simple and prosaic buildings, but at the same time with a very beautiful relationship to the landscapes they're in. So these are some extracts from the Ontario Towns book, and what's kind of incredible is the sort of very direct reference. There are buildings like this to be found all over the UK from the same period. They're all listed buildings. They're considered heritage assets, and you can't touch them basically unless you produce a tome describing how what you are doing is honoring and enhancing the heritage asset. And this was kind of interesting. It's a farmhouse made of checkerboard brick, and the kind of artisan quality of this type, which is also found throughout Britain's cities and is inspiring in terms of its materiality. And this very beautiful sort of farmhouse near Ottawa with its beautiful porch and veranda. These are all sort of deep in my psyche as being essential components of home and of dwelling. So this is a comparison of basically a house in Oxford and the Merrickville farmhouse, which both demonstrate similar characteristics, although with a very unique Ontario elliptical fan light over the front door as opposed to the semicircular. So the move to Guelph also for me was part of a kind of shift from an industrial town to a university town that did have an urban design. And here I've got plans of John Galt's sort of original concept for the town based on its sort of radial configuration and access to the cathedral, how it evolved into a bigger scheme, and very much drawing on the tradition of Wren's reconstruction of London and what's called Renaissance urban design, because Wren was obviously building on the tradition of the Renaissance. And that's a kind of very typical use of the word in Britain. So what is kind of significant for me and also relates to what's happening in Waterloo and other small cities that are the subject of this exhibition and this festival is that the kind of civic quality and clarity of Guelph's urban plan, supported by a quite coherent Georgian architecture, in effect, made of stone, primarily stone. This kind of consistency of material form and urban design is, I think, a kind of great heritage quality of Guelph. And here you can see the kind of quality of it at a sort of streetscape level. And this kind of urban heritage is something that every small city can build on, and we often neglect. And then the final sort of step in my journey, this is a kind of little synopsis of my fourth year project here at Waterloo and my thesis project. Both of these, strangely enough, are projects based on quadrangles. This was the Urban Design Center in Toronto. I designed a square, Clarence Square, a design center based on the idea of a warehouse adapted to new forms. And my thesis project, which was urban renewal revision, a strategy for re-inhabiting the vacant ghetto, which looks like this, which is the Ellicott district of Buffalo. And this was based on a series of garden squares along a sort of restored and newly imposed network of streets. These institutions, car culture, sports, playing fields, and a new sort of quadrangle as a mixed-use hybrid development as a catalyst to reactivate and re-urbanize a vacant city neighborhood. And in a way, this thesis project I see now as being, in a way, the project of my practice, this project of city building. And it's, although that wasn't intentional or overt when I started out my practice, it's funny how these things come to be they sort of emerge from your experience and become a project. And I think this, this slide just demonstrates very, as a synopsis, the projects that ABA has either built or is delivering across the UK. You can see mostly projects in London and the southeast, some in northern cities. This kind of demonstrates the economy of Britain as well. All of the economic activity is around London, and the north is still suffering. And then we've done competitions and various projects around Europe. And this is another image of the projects. Well, all of these projects are what we have either on site or in the office in planning stages at the moment. And so this is Accordia in Cambridge, which is built, the South Acton estate regeneration, Tribeca in Liverpool, another estate regeneration scheme. The South Kilburn estate regeneration, Dulles Valley estate regeneration. This is a master plan for 620 dwellings and a community centre based around 3 squares. A scheme in the Olympic Park, another scheme in Ealing in London. This is Bath, and this is Cambridge. So the reason I put these all together is to, in a way, test for myself the notion that maybe these buildings don't have to be housing, that they can be urban buildings, and it doesn't really matter what the use is. They can become office buildings, hotels, workplaces, studios, that housing is actually the kind of stuff of cities, and if it's robust, adaptable, and generous in its spatial characteristics and material characteristics, it can become a kind of adaptable future heritage. So this is my little reference to Darwin and evolution, his theory of evolution, that the fittest survive through adaptability, and I've added the term generosity because I think that's one of the kind of huge problems in the kind of collective consciousness of people who commission buildings, is the lack of generosity, and that in spatial terms and material terms, and that's what contributes to the decline and unsustainability of buildings. And this is a little project we did, a competition called Adaptable Futures, where our proposition was to sort of modify the warehouse typology, both in terms of spatial layout. It's a kind of hybrid of office building and warehouse, with floors at different heights, so you actually would rent volume instead of area. And that not only is the kind of rigor and kind of economy of construction part of its adaptability, but also the iconography. So the idea here was that the crest of Oxford Brookes University, who was a potential client for this building, was abstracted and enlarged to become a pattern within the glazed brick of the building. And so this combination of robustness, adaptability, and iconography means the building has more chances of survival in this climate, and as part of a kind of investment in the future. So, and here's another concept that I didn't really talk about last night, but something that drives our work, this notion of hybrids, that hybrid structures are also more adaptable, and some of the projects we're doing at the moment are looking at how to combine the principles of a mansion block with a warehouse and with kind of explorations in geometry, crystalline or trapezoidal geometries, as part of a process of translating these historical typologies into ones about our present condition. And this is another reference. This was our concept for our new Hall B housing, that a suburban development can be a kind of hybrid between a traditional English shopfront that you'd find on a normal street, a barn. This is a very famous barn in Essex, a Miesian patio house, and Brancusi's totems. And this was our sort of aspiration, that the development would have both a kind of sculptural quality, a reference to the local vernacular of barn buildings, and also that the suburban house would be transformed by having workspaces within the houses themselves, so that the suburb becomes a place of work. It's economically active. So, and this is the kind of DNA of our master plan, that the traditional house plot that's 5 meters wide and 25 meters long becomes a plot that's 12 meters by 12 meters. So you have the same land area, but the plot size changes, and it allows you to have a denser mat of urban form of each block. There are no gardens because they are packed back to back, but the spatial offer in these houses is about 25% bigger than what you would get in a standard British developer house. So this is just one. You can see lots of images of it on our website, but it's just to make the point about the idea of the hybrid. So each one of these front rooms in each house is an office. It's a home office. Some people even have signs up of what they're doing, like wedding photographers or, web designers. And the adaptable roof houses were sold with the top floor unconverted. For £8,000, you could put in a stair, line the loft, and get another room in the roof. So this kind of mixing of references and building in adaptability and spatial generosity is, I think, one of the sort of key reasons why this project has achieved such recognition in terms of British house building. So now I'll go back to London, and just like to refer to this evolution of London, because obviously it starts as a Roman settlement a couple of thousand years ago, and it incrementally grows. It's a sort of radial growth, and it evolves into a very dense network that continues to be radial and is interspersed by garden squares and parks. And so now London is one of the greenest cities in the world. It has one of the highest ratios of open green space per citizen compared to any other world city, but at the same time is very dense, but networked through a rail and transport and underground system that makes living in London actually quite sustainable. Nobody really owns a car in London anymore, unless you live on the edge and have somewhere to go at the weekend, which I don't, because I'm Canadian. I don't know anybody who lives outside of London. So it works for me, although I do have a car, I have to admit. So, and then this map I find really fascinating because it starts to reveal the kind of urban character of London as it grows with the advent of, or the institution of the royal parks, and then you can see the squares, garden squares in the center, and the outline, this red outline of where the Fire of London occurred and the reconstruction. And what I find really interesting in this quote is that the quote from Mogg was that his intention was to highlight the various city works and urban renewal projects which were being pursued or perused in the early 19th century. And it's kind of amazing to think that they were thinking about urban renewal in the early 19th century, even though the city was still growing, it was still in its infancy. And one of the other kind of main types of urban development model to which many people in London are now sort of building on, like developers and the kind of regeneration projects that are happening, are all building on the tradition of the London Garden Square, which was, in very simple terms, initially a kind of developer offer that to attract people to buy houses with the access via keys to the Garden Square. So the idea of London's Garden Square was actually coming from a very commercial development impetus, and now is one of the great assets of living in London. And that this sort of shows the distance between squares, which is not that much, and how the kind of grain and character of the city is hugely enriched by these sort of captured pieces of landscape. And of course there's Regent's Park and Hyde Park and St. James's Park and all of the other great park traditions. So in a way, all of these are part of a kind of principle that I adhere to and try to promote in my work, which is that housing is urban design. That you can't, and actually architecture in essence is urban design. You can never divorce urban design or urbanism from an active building, because you always impact the city or the place in which you build, and that housing should act as a cultural artifact, a meaningful and enriching a cultural artifact in terms of people's quality of life and the character and quality that it offers to the city as a kind of public act. And so if you sort of ask yourself when you design something, you know, are you giving meaningful information about the culture of the creators and users of this place through your architecture? It sort of makes you think quite hard about, you know, what a building like this is offering or saying about the culture, or what a building like this, a sort of classic American ranch house, or with a very distinctive roof and the veranda as a kind of hugely symbolic element that sort of says there's a semi-public space between this house, this building, and its landscape that invites its neighbors. Similar to Place des Vosges in Paris, which has a sort of incredible colonnaded base and makes a huge mark on the fabric of Paris, one of its few sort of garden squares that's open to the public. Oops, my sound just cut out. And so these references are also a sort of important part of the stories I sometimes tell when presenting propositions for work in the UK. And this is, again, a sort of zooming into the various places in London where we're doing regeneration schemes at the moment. And one of them is in the Olympic Legacy Master Plan. We're doing a competition at the moment on a team with with, I think, 5 other architects altogether to implement this whole side of the Olympic Park. This is it's going to provide 1,500 new homes and cultural center, school, all sorts of other uses within a sort of maximum build envelope of 6 stories. And actually the master plan is evolving so that it's only townhouses overlooking the park. And yes, and so this is the kind of initiative, the sort of city building initiative that's going on in London. This is on site right now, Chobham Manor, in between the Velodrome and Stratford, which has been completely rebuilt, Stratford City Centre. This is another master plan where one of our projects, we collaborated on this master plan for the South Acton Estate Regeneration with another practice, and that was phase 1, this is phase 2, and our building is on site at the moment. And it's very much about reconnecting the estate with a new series of streets and public squares and gardens, and then there are private garden courtyards in the center of each block. And there are also houses. So the principle is for every development that it provides mixed use tenure. Every development is 50% affordable, 50% private, maximum 6 to 9 stories high, and a mix of townhouses, terraced houses, courtyard houses, and urban blocks. So this is, and this is another estate where we have a project actually underway at the moment. It's in South Kilburn. This is an estate built in the 1960s, and this is sort of the second project that we've worked on, with the client being London Borough of Brent. And this is a kind of interesting contrast to some of our other projects where we're working for the developer at planning stage. We are working for a local authority who have taken the role of delivering schemes up to planning. Local authorities own tons of land in London, and so they have the ability to kind of secure parcels of land, sponsor a project up to planning, and then tender it to the market after the planning consent is granted, which removes the risk from the developer in designing something that might not get planning, and speeds up development and ensures that each local authority is rebuilding its estates according to a long-term vision of the urban character and grain of that neighborhood. So when we were bidding, this was also a competition. We bid on a team for this with another architect to do this site. I always refer back to the sort of 1880 or 1890 Victorian plan of London, which was a kind of, in a way, a sort of perfect urban design. You know, very legible major streets, which are boulevards with larger buildings lining them. Then smaller blocks as you move into the kind of neighborhood away from the major streets. And these were generally terraced houses or mansion blocks, and then there was a park at the center of the site. There's just a kind of consistency and clarity to Victorian urban planning that doesn't really get talked about very much. I think it's a good subject for somebody to pursue who's still at school. So this is our the overview of the site. So here it's called Bronte and Fielding House, which is kind of poignant after Emily Bronte and Henry Fielding. And this is that's actually Bronte House. So this kind of green character that comes across in this slide is actually more like this. It's a concrete parking podium with towers on it. And it's a place of severe social deprivation and drug dealing and gangs and all sorts of bad things. And it was something I actually encountered in the first weeks I lived in London. The bus I took went past the south, actually went down this road and past the estate, and I was completely shocked by what I saw. And this was in 1989, so it's only being redeveloped now, which shows you how long urban master plans take to enact. So this is a figure ground plan that obviously shows the sort of atomization of buildings in the kind of context of very coherent and consistent urban Victorian terraces. And this is the master plan as it stands now. ABA has actually reworked the whole master plan on behalf of Brent Council to sort of update it and include the new developments that have happened in the last 5 years along here. And then we were asked to come up with a completely new master plan for the centre of the scheme. And so our revised master plan for this area is now becoming part of the statutory planning guidance for Brent, for the South Kilburn estate. Sorry, this is out of order. That was the master plan 5 years ago, and this is the current master plan. So the first piece of work we did for Brent was a site sort of at the top of the plan where we basically infilled in what was a sort of empty part of the site. I think my slide actually flipped around. So here, well, you can sort of see that the buildings that we've inserted to create a new kind of urban block and a muse sort of is part of repairing and restoring this clarity to the street and built frontages and front doors opening onto the street as opposed to the slab block in space. And these are actually 2-story maisonettes with 2 stories of flats above. There's little muse houses and then a little apartment building here and a kind of completion of a flat iron block. And so we've created a kind of modified garden square. And then this is the kind of volumetric master plan that we've just updated for the South Kilburn estate. And it shows our first scheme I just talked about up here, Ely Court. The scheme we have on site right now, which is Bronte House and Fielding House, which completes or restores the urban boulevard. And then new proposals for urban blocks and actually a new school and a new park. And it's the first new park to be built in Brent for about 100 years. So this is the typology that we've referred to and that I've been sort of promoting for about the last 5 years in London, the Victorian mansion block, typical of Maida Vale and around Albert Hall and Hyde Park and Bayswater, which I think is a sort of fantastic model for quite high density family housing. It makes sort of great streets. They have a kind of continental scale, but there's a sort of inherent domestic quality to these buildings. They have a very kind of quite ornamental front door, lots of balconies, lots of balustrading bay windows, and an articulated roof. And this forms a kind of module. So there are 8 flats in this module, and then the module is repeated. And you get this very coherent and kind of reassuring streetscape from this typology. So our scheme for the Bronte and Fielding House was sort of referring to the Victorian street pattern, understanding it in relation to the new development and bringing in the kind of mansion block typology with its communal gardens at the center of the block as the format for restoring this piece of Kilburn. And this is the sort of how our contemporary module works for the mansion block. It's kind of amazing because you can make any sort of mix of, this could be sort of 100% 1-bedroom flats, or it can be 2-story, 4-bedroom maisonettes, a 3-bed maisonette, 1-bed flats, 2-bed flats, 3-bed duplexes or penthouses on the roof. And so this idea of mixing the demographic and the tenure and the value of future residents means you have a sort of automatic mixed community, which is generally seen in London as being, it's not only a good thing, it's actually legislated. You have to have a mixed community in every development, and it has to be tenure blind. So this is how all of these elements pack together in our mansion block, and it slightly modifies at one end, and then we have a little building that's a little bit like a maple leaf in plan. It sort of turned out like that by chance. It wasn't intentional, but it was the only form that we could devise that complied with all of the offsets and distances from its neighbors. Turned this kind of terrible suburban corner of the street layout, the sort of 1960s street layout, and created more of a sort of landscape setting at the south end of the communal garden square. And I'll just point out, maybe you can see in these sort of layouts for the flats, they're dual aspect flats, so bedrooms leading onto porches at the front of the house, sort of verandas, living rooms, and kitchens at the back onto a private garden. And all of the space standards for every dwelling are regulated by the Mayor's Housing Design Guide. So you cannot design flats that are undersized, not wheelchair accessible, don't have daylight and sunlight into every room, and don't have natural cross ventilation. So this idea of kind of government legislating space standards and housing standards is, I think, universally accepted in London as the best thing that's happened in London's kind of development scene in the last 10 years. That was Boris Johnson's initiative, actually, the Mayor's Housing Design Guide. And this is how the same typology we adapted for the Chawba Manor, one of the Olympic legacy schemes. So it's got integrated parking, an elevated landscape, and then terraced and townhouses embedded in the courtyard. So it's a higher density model. I think Aidan Mitchell-Moore did this drawing. He might be here in the audience. So everybody should give a round of applause to Aidan for this beautiful yeah, I should probably mention everybody who's worked for me, but I'm going to start forgetting their names. But no, Aidan did a brilliant job on this competition. And this is just a diagram illustrating how we often talk about pattern and scale. When you're working with really big, long buildings, it's really important to sort of generate sort of diversity, and we sort of play with the perception of scale by having sort of really big double height bay windows and balconies and huge 2-story high dormer windows that refer to the sort of arts and crafts tradition of studios in the roof. And this is with a sort of mansard roof. And then you can see through to the communal gardens from the entrances. You, of course, will never see the building like that. You'll only ever see it like this. So we tend to design everything in 3D model and in perspective, and don't do elevations till the very, very, very end. And this just sort of communicates how I see the role of this building as framing the street, framing the view to St. Augustine's Church, really fantastic neo-Gothic church, and sort of restoring a sense of kind of place and a kind of civic public realm that's clearly public with the sort of private world of dwelling and of home contained within the body of the block. And we've also incorporated a new little public square and a boulevard that passes from one side of the block to the other. And this is a photograph that was taken about 2 weeks ago or a month ago of Bronte House coming down. So it's amazing how it sort of reminds you of Pruitt-Igoe and the kind of famous death of modernism when the very first of the sort of 60s tower blocks came down so dramatically. So next I'm going to talk about Bath, which is in a contrast in terms of the context, a complete contrast. And Bath is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It does have Roman baths at its center. It is a spa town originally, both for the Romans and the Georgians and the Victorians after them. And obviously had its kind of great urban heyday in the 18th and 19th centuries when the crescents of Bath took shape. And I should mention, in a way, Bath epitomizes the idea of future heritage, because this is a city that has a huge kind of tourist income, which is a direct product of its architectural quality and its urban quality and heritage, but it's also a university town, and it has a growing high-tech economy, a sort of high-tech corridor between Bath and Bristol. So, you know, you might think, or I've been sort of told, well, you can't refer to Bath because it's like in your work, because it's too beautiful and too extraordinary for anybody to try to emulate. But I kind of feel like, of course, you should try to emulate the most beautiful and consistent city that's been produced in Britain, because that's where the aspirations should lie. Why shouldn't we aim for the kind of highest level of what can be achieved when there's a kind of coherent vision? And some of this coherence comes through because of the material of Bath. Obviously, it's made of Bath stone, the quarries that existed around Bath itself. And this kind of really amazing way that the streets both contain the space of the street, kind of frame the kind of urban boundary, and set this great counterpoint to the hills and landscapes of Somerset. So our project is in Bath is just off this tourist map. It's just over there. But I think it's also interesting to try to produce a tourist map of every city that you're interested in looking at, because tourist maps kind of show the landmarks, both in architectural terms. Normally they show the kind of architectural features, but this also shows the kind of clarity and distinctiveness of the great crescents which characterize Bath, built by John Wood the Elder and John Wood the Younger in the late 18th century. And so this figure ground plan shows this kind of very clear urban structure, and our site, which is over here, which is on the edge of what was formerly an engineering works, a Stoddart and Pitt engineering works that produced the cranes, sort of shipping yard cranes, all over the British Empire. Obviously, it's no longer active. All the steelwork for big infrastructure like that's made in China now. And so this was subject to a regeneration master plan by Field and Clegg Bradley several years ago for the developer Crest Nicholson. And we had the opportunity to compete for a site here, which you can see our scheme is already there. But it's quite interesting. One of the great things about working in housing is that the scale and scope of a housing scheme normally does read or have an impact as a new figure ground, a new sort of urban form that appears on that kind of drawing. And this shows our very close neighbour in the scheme, which is Norfolk Crescent, which is a later example of the Bath Crescent, and this kind of horror here on our boundary, which is a big box Sainsbury's store with a parking lot all around it, the kind of development that was allowed in the 70s and 80s and now would never, ever, ever happen in a city like Bath, because they realize that this kind of development kills urban quality and reduces their chances of retaining their status as a World Heritage Site, because UNESCO come around and check your city every couple of years to make sure you're not doing anything to, detract or diminish the name and the status of a UNESCO World Heritage Site. There's also another unfortunate car park back here. So our site has a kind of unique position adjacent to the river on a sort of promontory and quite unusual triangular configuration, which was kind of unfortunate, but kind of led to interesting speculations. And this very famous photo of the Royal Crescent also was part of our sort of point of reference for the scheme, that although the front facade, the formal facade of the Crescent has a very clear ordering, which was actually inspired by the Colosseum, apparently. So Rome comes to Britain in the form of a Bath crescent that embraces the landscape. And each one of these pieces of the crescent was developed and offered to the market in the Georgian period to various purchasers who built their house in the manner that they wished. And so the backs have a completely different character to the fronts, which is quite interesting and playful, and this idea of a back which has a different relationship to the city, to the front, which has a specific relationship to the landscape, was something we talked about in our scheme. And the other being just the very coherent, quite sculptural quality of the facades, the rhythm and depth. And these are sculptures by Rachel Whiteread, who has, she won the Turner Prize for this house, which was called House in, I think, Ghost House in 1993, I think. And we refer to these because of the intention that the housing that we're producing can act like sculptures on a plinth. That the kind of the quietness of material but the kind of plasticity of the form are what informs our approach to the architecture, rather than as a sort of driving concept. And so this idea of the Bath crescent, which we've sort of taken and snipped into 3 pieces, so that everybody living on the development gets to live in a crescent. Nobody is kind of excluded from the thrill of living in a Bath crescent. And then each crescent is modified according to its orientation and use and the type. And we end up with 3 variations on the crescent. One is semi-detached houses, which allow a sort of permeable filter to the river, a sort of urban compact terrace facing the rest of the development, and a muse building. And so this is a kind of early 3-dimensional rendering of our scheme, which starts to show how actually the roof becomes a very important element of the scheme. Bath is on a hill, so everybody looks down on our site, and the 15 preservation societies that you have to consult with in Bath were very concerned about the roofscape and the quality of the roof, but at the same time we also try to use the roof as both an important means of creating character, sort of domestic character, that it reads as a clearly domestic building, a series of houses, a terrace, and that something interesting is happening spatially up here. And they're acting as apertures to frame views to the landscape. So this is the kind of final layout for the site. It's a little bit trapped. This is going to be a future development, a redevelopment of the site by Sainsbury's, and the hope is that this will be restored as a series of streets. And this shows actually how it sort of operates on its plinth. And this is not a solid plinth, it's a permeable stone wall, because this is a floodplain. So the Avon River floods every spring up to here. So the entire landscape has been decontaminated and reconfigured as a really beautiful river walk that connects down right to the center of Bath. And these houses have no front garden or back garden, they just have a terrace at the front and back. And again, the idea is that because we compensate with a communal landscape and roof terraces, there isn't a need for a traditional garden with lawns. And so this is the site layout. It's quite tight. There are cars and garages in here on plot. But the way the houses work, the ground floor, there's a double height space connecting the ground floor and the first floor, a piano nobile, living room, roof terrace, bedrooms, and a kind of spectacular roof, which can be used as anything from family room to bedroom to offices. And it has this kind of spatial quality, as a kind of viewing platform to the landscape. And I just wanted to make the point again about the sort of great thing about working in housing is that you work simultaneously at so many different scales. It's the urban scale, how it operates as a sort of urban artifact. Also the quality of the dwelling spaces and how it all comes together as a home. But maybe one day it will be adapted and it will become like the Crescents of Bath, hotels, offices, even the home of the Oxford Preservation Trust, which at the moment is in one of the Crescents of Bath. So these images show how the development works as a sort of piece, in a way, set piece in the landscape, but also has a very intimate kind of courtyard and muse quality. And this is how it looks on site at the moment. I was there last week, and so the site is progressing, very constrained and difficult to manage all of the everything on this very tight triangular site. And this is the dormers in their first stages of execution, and the carpenters are kind of struggling but conquering the geometry of the splayed dormer, which is our the kind of unique element that we've been developing at ABA, and this is how the framing is starting to work out on the interior. And I must add that this is a kind of blue chip housing developer who's delivering this development, and these houses are going to be in 100% Bath stone, 75 mil thick load-bearing Bath stone. So the argument that you can't use high quality materials because the development won't generate a return or a value, it's a fiction in most cases, because if you can develop houses like this in solid Bath stone, you know, the I don't know what other constraints you can. Obviously the development equation has to do with the cost and the return, but it is possible to build buildings in stone and make money even as a blue chip housing developer. So finally I'm going to talk about our project in Oxford, and we were invited to participate in a competition. It was 25 participants, narrowed down to 5 in the short list, and the commission was for a fully residential teaching academic quadrangle for Exeter College as a second campus to their Turl Street campus in the centre of Oxford. And so a quadrangle, an Oxford quad, is actually a kind of, it's a community, it's a scholastic or scholarly community who live and study and teach all in one place. And that's what the collegiate model of Oxford and Cambridge provides, and it's kind of unique in the world. And so the opportunity to develop and design one of these quads was a kind of great honor, and also an incredibly onerous challenge to work in the context of Oxford, which is just packed with incredible examples of, first of all, this Christopher Wren, the Sheldonian, the Oxford Museum, Christ College, the kind of streetscapes, and the infamous skyline of Oxford is something that kind of weighs on the shoulders of anybody who tries to build in Oxford. And so it's a great opportunity, but also a great challenge. So we won the competition in 2011. It was a sort of 5-month competition process, and it took about 2.5 years to get it through planning. At the same time, we delivered construction documents last autumn, and now the project is on site. So it's been 3.5 years since we first started the competition. This shows the existing Exeter College Quadrangle at the centre of Oxford. They're kind of satellite residential accommodation and teaching accommodation, which they want to concentrate into the new site, which is here on the site of the former Ruskin College, adjacent to Worcester College, which is a grade 1 listed college by Hawksmoor and its gardens. So this is the sort of zooming in. So it's about an 8-minute walk from the Turl Street Quad to our site, and it shows the kind of proximity. This is the historic core of Oxford, and here you can kind of see the kind of quadrangle, the morphology of Oxford and its city centre is a series of quads, all of which are colleges, completely independent, autonomous quads. The University of Oxford is a separate entity, which is mainly based up here. So each college quad has its own character, its own fellows, its own. It's a complete sort of world unto itself. And this is the kind of context of the city centre, Exeter College. Oops, I just missed a slide. And this again shows the sort of morphology of the city, which is based on quads that used to be monastic communities, which were also places where the aristocracy sent their sons mainly to be educated, and after the dissolution of the monasteries they became colleges. And so this kind of monastic format of the fortified monastery has become the academic collegiate model, which is both a teaching a figure of teaching and of a sort of urban and domestic life. So it's a kind of incredibly powerful thing. This is an etching of Exeter College, sort of 18th century etching, which we referred to in our sort of competition submission, the idea that a quad, an Oxford quad, is made up, although it has a consistent perimeter, it's often made up of different styles and periods of architecture by different hands, but they achieve their coherence through the format of the quadrangle. And then these are the Fellows Gardens here. And it's now Giles Gilbert Scott there's a chapel in one of these quads. So there's also a tradition of building sort of jewel-like buildings in the middle of quadrangles as the need to densify and expand took place. This is Exeter College seen from Broad Street, and another kind of prominent characteristic is the roof line that expresses a lot of these dormers were actually extensions and additions to the original buildings for student accommodation. So the roof line of Oxford, although it's kind of seen as a set piece, is something that has evolved over hundreds of years, and we had to use this argument in our project to justify our designs to Oxford City Council, that the tradition of an evolving roofscape was something that we were building on, like both technologically in terms of functionality and format and material. This is my client, the Fellows of Oxford College. There's 44 fellows, each fellow is responsible for tutoring students, normally 2 or 3 at a time, in their fellows sets or fellow studies that are within the body of the college. So the driving concept for our scheme was this idea of the scholarly home, that the new quad has to be a home not only for the fellows but also for the students. And what is the image of the scholarly home, and how can the sort of traditional collegiate quad be reinterpreted for the 21st century? So this, one of the sort of DNA of the Oxford and Cambridge quad is the idea of the stair, 2 rooms to a stair. So people generally identify where they live in the quad by which stair they're at. They belong to stair number 3 or stair number 5. And so the stair itself is an important sort of experiential part of living in an Oxford quad. So if we move to our site, This is Ruskin College in its sort of heyday, 1913. It was built in a sort of late Edwardian, or what's called the English institutional Baroque. There's many different names for this style of architecture, but was considered a kind of mediocre example of the period and not worthy of a listing. But it does exemplify the sort of aspirations of Ruskin College, which was a working men's college founded in the late 19th century, not by Ruskin himself, because he was too old by then, but they took on the name of Ruskin College. And it has a very strong social history. It was a site of the very first women's lib protest in Oxford, and John Prescott and various eminent socialists and representatives of the labour movement in Britain were educated here at Ruskin College. So we were working in the context of this this kind of piece of social history of Oxford, and at the same time on the boundary of a Grade 1 listed garden of Worcester College, a Victorian street with institutions along its length, and a sort of artisan quarter called Jericho of workers' accommodation. And this quality, or this position of the building, sort of led our approach to the scheme in terms of its role as an urban building. The building was added to incrementally in the 1930s, the 1960s, the 1980s, so it's a kind of hodgepodge of architectural styles, and it's kind of terrible in its current state. It was vacated by Ruskin College about 3 years ago. And it has a kind of strange proportions, and it doesn't follow the golden section or the other proportional rules of the period. It's a kind of value engineered version, we think. They sort of ran out of money and didn't build the vision that was part of the original scheme for Ruskin College. So again, this shows its kind of position in terms of its context. A very constrained site, 25 meters wide and about 80 meters long. So the challenge for us was to respond to these various conditions, the sort of institutional nature of Walton Street. That's the Oxford University Press up the road, Clarendon Institute of Chinese Studies, which is here. Its role as a kind of bookend at the opposite Hawksmoor's building, and then its role in kind of respecting the context of Jericho and the sort of artisan nature. So these diagrams were part of our initial expression of interest, where we had to communicate our approach on one A4 page. This is one of very few images that we put on that page. And I highlighted it because lots of fellows afterwards told me they thought this was the most interesting thing that they saw of all of the submissions at the first stage of the competition, because it showed them actually the possibilities and potentials inherent in the site, depending on the format of the layout, the sort of typology of the quad. So the existing quad is more or less like that, but it's much messier. You know, we just tried to show that as an architect, you consider all of these different things and you test them, or we test them anyway, and consider the impact of sort of taking a quad that's single aspect facing a garden and breaking it into three, a sort of small courtyard, a big courtyard, a tiny courtyard, making an E-shaped plan. What are the implications and potentials of completely overturning and exploding the traditional quad, or modifying it and inverting it or tweaking it? So this evolved in the second stage of our competition. This was the sort of empty square we left, was this is what we're going to do in the next stage of the competition if we make it through. And this is a kind of diagram of our final scheme, which is an S-shaped quad. It's called the S-shaped quad, so it's kind of this, really, but with an expanded center. And the concept was that this expanded center would offer a new facility for Oxford students, which is the Learning Commons, which is a social learning space. And that generally doesn't exist in Oxford colleges. There's the hall, there's the lecture theatre, there's the dining hall, there's common rooms, but there isn't something that just allows kind of social learning in the way that we do in our contemporary world. And so this shifted from the sort of C-shaped quad to the S-shaped quad was create the potential for a narrative, a sort of various experiences along this route, from the kind of formal institutional frontage of Walton Street to a more intimate and private world of Worcester College with its sort of domestic neighbours. And this supports a kind of diagram of sort of Porter's Lodge and public functions at the front, the Learning Commons at the centre, and then the lecture hall is the destination at the end of a route through two cloisters, each facing in a different direction. This route also has a kind of landscape element because the site slopes. We get sort of three different levels happening at the centre of the site, and you can pass from one quad to the other through the building. And altogether, this creates this sort of ambulatory, that's a three-dimensional ambulatory through the site, a kind of never-ending loop, each of which offers a different experience of the city and of the building itself. And also encourages interaction and congregation of the student and teaching community. So this site plan shows how the original scheme sort of transforms with the S-shaped scheme. The other major constraint was rights of light and height limitations. So we very strictly adhered to the existing rights of light angle that comes from the adjacent properties, but managed to squeeze in an additional floor. And the intention was to kind of soften this additional volume through the curved plane of the roof, which would also become a very important kind of expressive quality of the character and form of the roof and the quad itself. So starting with this is a sort of cartoon of the existing site. It's accretion of various buildings from various periods. What happens if you like really max out the rights of light angle, and we push the volume away from the street in order to get more volume onto the site. Optimize the site is the word. You can't say maximize the site because then they'll say you're overdeveloping the site. So you have to say optimizing the site. So we optimized the site and then modified the volumes to respond to the scale and character of its neighbors. And then the kind of wrapping of all of these volumes in this kind of sinuous curving roof lends the scheme a kind of coherence and an identity and a material quality that we developed, which is about announcing the fact that this is now Exeter College, it's not Ruskin College, and the patterning of this roof refers to the arts and crafts tradition of both its neighbours and of William Morris, who is a graduate of of Exeter College and a student of Ruskin. So the connections are many and varied across times and cultures. This diagram illustrates very simply the concept of excavating the basement. So this is where the archive is going to go. The archive is contained within a stone plinth, which is carved for the Learning Commons, upon which is the cloister and the hall, the student accommodation, and then the all-encompassing roof. And so this, in a nutshell, is sort of 6 stories of accommodation: the basement, the ground floor, first floor, second floor. So it's 90 student rooms. The 3rd floor with the fellows' studies opening onto roof terrace, and then the 4th floor with more fellows' studies tucked up under the roof. And these are the final plans. These are a sort of stripped out version of the typical first floor plan. So you can see it's quite efficient. The sort of student rooms all with ensuite bathrooms, family kitchen at the heart of the quad, And one of the main intentions, this is going to be the first building in Oxford that's fully disabled accessible. Most of the listed structures are not accessible at all to less able students or staff. So this building has 2 lifts and 3 stairs, so 1, 2, 3. So we couldn't quite adhere to the concept of 6 rooms to a stair, but I think we've managed to create sort of quite distinct elements of the quad so that each arm is its own kind of community. And this is a typical student room with the principle of sort of diffuse light washing across the study space and the window with its window seat, taking in the views from adjacent landscapes. So this is a top floor plan. So this shows the fellows' studies, which look down to the east and west into each quadrangle and give access onto a roof terrace that's carved out of the roof. And then the very top floor of fellows. So these are fully self-sufficient apartments. So this is an early study, a modeling of the roof form, the wrapping, in effect, of the new accommodation within this curvilinear skin, and then the stone base, creating a sort of walled garden. And this is an important sort of public access to the lecture hall, which is going to be open to community functions. And in section, you can see the sort of height of the building, and at the center, the other great thing about the S shape is that it allows the sort of maximum point of circulation to happen in that place of the Learning Commons. And so the idea was the principle of maximizing encounters, social encounters, through the configuration of the building. So this was a sort of competition render, which proved to be quite controversial in planning terms, and the neighbours, Worcester College, weren't too thrilled about this coming into their view. But it sort of established the principle of preserving the Ruskin College facade and then stepping the volumes down to respond to the sort of little 2 stories artisan cottages of next door. These are the consultations that we had to undertake over this 2-year period to convince everybody that we were doing the right thing. But I shouldn't be so flippant about it. What's actually really good about places like Oxford is that you do have this dialogue, that there is this questioning and testing, that you have to lead not only your client, the client is generally convinced, it's the stakeholders and the preservation and conservation societies and the neighboring the neighbors and English heritage who actually demand a highly articulated defense, like a thesis, of the project, and want it explained generally every month between when you first approach them and until they feel that you've prepared enough information to make a planning application. And so this is a kind of this is just the books, some of the books that we had to produce, not even the drawings, of justifying our scheme on all sorts of terms: landscape, ecology, heritage, conservation statement, access statement, everything under the sun. And this was a book that we had to produce which outlined the history of the evolution of roofs in Oxford, and that was a supplementary document to our planning submission that placed our roof design in the context of the evolution of Oxford's roofs from the 11th century to the present day. So the academic work doesn't stop, basically, when you're working in places like Oxford. And this is just an extract from some of the many pages of material we had to produce to justify our scheme. And this actually shows the original vision the 1909 vision for Ruskin College, which was much more closely aligned with the late Renaissance neoclassicism of many of England's sort of 17th century buildings. And this is the tradition on which Joseph and Smitham were drawing when they did this competition scheme. So their intention was that there would be a kind of palatial facade on the sort of side street, symmetrical in elevation, but not symmetrical in plan, because you can see the pediment here doesn't align with the center of the cloister. But the intention was to sort of emulate the Oxford quad with a cloistered space and traditional rooms, porter's lodge, common room, and service spaces. But the key thing about this drawing was the height of the roof and the proportions, and the height of the dormers, because that was the most controversial thing about our scheme. So in a way, this existing context, this is the kind of streetscape montage of what was there until recently, being replaced by a kind of coherent architectural proposition had to be justified in historic terms according to the original vision of the scheme and the principle of a higher roof that related proportionally to its base. And this section sort of demonstrates the kind of capacity of the building sectionally and the excavating of the quad to create an amphitheater and a cafe, and how this was the sort of east or south-facing elevation. I don't normally show elevations because I don't really believe in them, but I think it's just important to show the kind of extent and how this building sort of works very hard to accommodate its many uses within quite a modest envelope. And this was the view that caused the most contention, because this is the view from the Grade 1 listed gardens of Worcester College. So at the moment there's a one-story building there, and we were proposing a two-story building, and this kind of held up the building in planning for about half a year. So these discussions about height and scale are relative to context. This is the basement plan, and here is the archive. There's going to be a completely super high-tech archive for the college's special collection, which includes the Kelmscott Bible and many sort of really significant pieces of literature, and Anne Boleyn's diaries. They've got just amazing things in their library. And down here is basically the stair from the Learning Commons, the cafe, amphitheater, junior common room, service spaces, archive study room. And then on the ground floor, porter's lodge, public rooms, seminar and study rooms, the stair number 1, the cloister leading across the south quad, more study rooms and offices, the Learning Commons, which is this kind of space in 4 levels, the north quad here with its cloister, study rooms, and then finally the hall, multi-purpose hall. And this route leads into a foyer space, and then what we've called the wall walk. So the principle of a continuous ambulatory has been maintained through all the vagaries of design development. I think I showed that already. So this is the existing building, and this is our transformation, what's called an intervention in heritage terms, that our intervention at roof level, which pretty much stays modest, is relatively modest in terms of streetscape, but does provide allow the rest of the building to accommodate about 15 more rooms than they'd anticipated. And then just the role of the dormers and breaking up the roof line. We've had to retain, this is a facade retention, which I don't really believe in, but we tried to save the existing 1909 building, but it was too inaccessible in terms of corridor widths and stairs. And so the argument of accessibility for the disabled took precedence over preserving the kind of heritage building. So this is the view from the Porter's Lodge leading to the south cloister with the south quad on the left. And our inspiration in a way for that cloister was these windows, these slightly later than Palladian windows, but just the principle of arched, semicircular arched windows which runs throughout the existing building. We've translated into a kind of contemporary idiom with these timber fins, each of which has a profile that's defined by an elliptoidal shape. So the idea was that the cloister, rather than being a linear series of frames, would swell sort of spatially and transform so that you could sort of gather and hang around and have more generous space. So it would become a place rather than just a corridor. And then the north quad is convex, so or concave, sorry, so that it opens up at each end and compresses in the middle. So this study kind of informed also our approach to the structure for the whole, and results through many months of detailed design development to this view of the south quad leading down to the cafe. And these are the fellows studies up there. So this is where students will be taught, up in the roof. This is the cafe as seen from the amphitheater. And we've been exploring sort of translating William Morris patterns into new tiles and sort of concrete imprints, if they're not value engineered out of the budget, but to sort of draw some of the tradition of Morris and his amazing creative output into the new quad. And this is the view of the learning commons, so the sort of multi-level space with quiet study areas, a mezzanine level leading up to the north quad in the hall. A view of this space from the north quad, so there you can go down to the cafe, and there's a sort of hanging study room up here on the left. And finally the hall, which acts as both a destination and a place from which you can look back towards the quad itself. The various layouts of the rooms and our sort of structural explorations. It's going to be a glulam structure, the same material as the cloisters, and it's actually self-supporting. Each of these sort of curlicue beams is a quite efficient structure in terms of the shear moment diagram, which is kind of amazing. But it was, I'm going to actually publish all of those drawings so that it's understood how this piece of structural gymnastics actually works. And then the top floor, I think I've sort of run through these in earlier slides, but the most important message is that the roof, the curved roof, is not just an aesthetic thing or a willful gesture or a device for reducing the apparent mass and bulk, but it delivers a kind of spatial quality that will make it sort of unique among Oxford's roofscapes, and has a kind of softening effect, both in terms of the building form and the spaces under the roof, and something quite extraordinary in terms of framing the views to the neighboring city. And finally, the roof material. We drew our reference and our inspiration from the flesh of the Giles Gilbert Scott Chapel, which is in Exeter College's Turl Street Quad. There, all of the spires have leaded fleshes, and this kind of patterning and iconography of the spire we felt was both an expression of craft, sort of roof craft that is gradually disappearing, but there still is a craft-based industry of metal roofing in the UK, and that we could draw on that and the sort of beautiful tiling of the chapel, and bring that into the quad in a new way. So the sort of checkerboard tiling of the roof is actually a very contemporary material. It's Rimex, which is a patented process by a British firm that works in Enfield, just in the east end of London, and it's oxidized stainless steel, and depending on the chemical mix, the sort of top layer, the molecular layer on the surface of the stainless steel can be modified to produce different colors and reflections. So there's very subtle patterning. We've produced about 6 mock-ups to try to achieve the right effect of a kind of iridescent and subtly patterned skin that represents Exeter College in its new site in Jericho, with its particular character, and gives the college itself a completely new identity. So this is the scheme. It's actually on site. The demolition contractors have got up to about here on the site. It's going to be completed in May 2016. And I'll just conclude with this quote, which is from Edward Ralph, who is actually a Canadian geographer. He teaches at University of Toronto, and he wrote the book Place and Placelessness in 1976, which was the first book to describe or analyze in a kind of scholarly manner the notion of place and placelessness as its opposition. And I used this quotation from his book in a recent competition submission for Northwest Cambridge, and it seemed to strike many chords. We won the competition, but I think it's an important point of reference for our work, not just in housing, but also in projects like Exeter College, where the idea of home, a place where one dwells and a place where you derive your identity and from which you look out on the rest of the world, is such an important aspect of our well-being and our sense of community. I'll end there, so thank you everybody for listening, and I'd be happy to take questions.